what we're going to do is walk you through the organ, essentially, to tell you just what it's about and why it is as distinctive as it is, because this is not the usual organ from 1914. It was built by Griffin and Leggo. Griffin and Leggo were local builders. They had a factory at Piermont in Point Street, and they were active for only 7 years. In those 7 years, they built a total of 9 new organs. So this is one of 9. They also did some other work. They built some or rebuilt some older organs. They fixed some organs. They even went over to Fiji to do some work on organs. The organs were not large. There are no large Griffin and Leggo organs, but they were very definitely instruments of quality. The organ of this church dates from 1914. The church was built in 1862. I understand there was a harmonium here before the organ was installed. It was originally an instrument with 2 manuals and 8 stops. There were 4 stops on the grate, 3 stops on the swell, and a sub-bass on the pedal. The organ was designed by organist and organ designer Joseph Earnshaw, quote, with space for extra stops. And those stops were added in the 1970s. The extra stops, which I'll name, were a 15th on the grate, a Gedacht 8 and a flute 4 on the swell. And if they were actually the stops that Earnshaw designed, it will be the only instance anywhere, I think, of a Griffin and Leggo organ that has what we call a 2-foot stop. Now, a 2-foot stop is a stop that actually sounds 2 octaves above the pitch that you play it at. So an 8-foot stop sounds at the pitch you play it at. A 4-foot stop sounds 1 octave above the pitch you play it at, and a 2-foot stop sounds 2 octaves above the pitch you play it at. Now, the idea of those stops is to make the sound brighter, of course. Now, Earnshaw, in designing this and other organs around Sydney, had a philosophy, a design philosophy that he said was the philosophy for design of a new type of organ. It was described at the time as providing foundation tone whilst allowing as much variety of tone as possible by reason of every stop being distinct in character. So what he tried to do essentially was to get an organ that made it sound by putting together a whole lot of different colours. Typically this was done using what I would call boldly voiced 8-foot and 4-foot stops. In other words, they are solid, and you can hear the solid nature of those stops when the organ plays. In most instances there was a solitary board-on or a sub-bass on the pedal division. All the pipes in Griffin and Leggo organs were manufactured and voiced by Alfred Palmer and Sons in London, which is interesting. Many of the people who manufactured organs here made their own pipes, or they had local pipe makers, but all of these were done overseas and brought over to Australia. Now, what I want to do to show how this organ works, and Dickson's agreed to help out, is just to go through each of the stops. So the first stop is the open diapason on the great organ. Now, there are 2 manuals on this organ. The bottom manual is called the great, the top manual is called the swell. The reason it's called the swell is that you can use a volume pedal to change the volume of that upper manual, where the great organ just sounds the same volume all the time. Now, the open diapason is basically regarded as the foundation of organ tone. So Dickson, can you just play a little bit of the open diapason on the grate? Interestingly, that is such a bold stop that you could use that on its own to accompany a congregation singing. It is really powerful, it's really strong. Now, the next stop that was on the grate is a tibia minor 8-foot stop. Now, what a tibia minor is, because you might think, what the heck is a tibia minor? It's basically a flute, but a very large scale flute. Let's hear the tibia minor. Certainly large scale. That's not the sort of flute you would hear in a symphony orchestra, is it? But it's a fluty sound, and very different from the open diapason. So the third stop on the grate is a dolce 8. Now a dolce is a soft flute stop. So let's hear that. Now, the final stop on the grate, as it was originally in 1914, is called a Geigen Principal 4. So it sounds one octave above what you're playing. Now, a Geigen Principal is basically a diapason, the foundation tone of the organ, but it's something that has a rather stringy quality to it. So let's hear that. Now, just for comparison, can you use the diapason, Dickson, an octave above how it speaks? Just the open diapason on its own, but an octave above, and play that to compare it. So you can see it's similar, and yet it's different. So the stops are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. Now, those 4 stops on the grate were as this organ was in 1914. So let's use those 4 stops together, the open diapason, the tibia minor, the dolce 8 and the Geigen Principal 4, and see what it sounds like. That's only 4 stops, but once again, very big sound. In the 1970s, a 15th was added to the grate. So do we want to play the 15th just to show what it does? Well, perhaps we ought to add it to what we've got, and just to show what it does. Hear it on its own now. What it's doing, of course, is just putting that brightness on the top of the sound. And it really does fit in quite well with the general scheme of the organ. Right, let's move to the upper manual, the swell. The first thing that was there was a gems horn 8-foot. Now, what a gems horn is a sort of a hybrid. We hear about hybrids a lot now with motor vehicles. Well, this is an organ stop hybrid, and it's meant to be partly flute, partly string. So let's hear that. I think that lives up to what it's supposed to do. It's got that stringy sound, but it's still got that fluty sound to it. The next one is a viol d'orchestra. My French is terrible, but a viol is a string stop, obviously, and this one is very stringy indeed. Yet although it's stringy, it really has a lovely sound to it. Now, the third stop that was originally on the organ in 1914 was a closed horn at 8-foot pitch. Now, a closed horn is the sort of stop that you put on an organ which is small when you want both an oboe and a trumpet sound, but you can't justify having an oboe stop and a trumpet stop. So a closed horn is sort of halfway in between. So it's not as bright perhaps as a trumpet, and it's perhaps not as stringy as an oboe, but it's not bad for doing anything. So you could play a trumpet tune with this, or you could play something that was an oboe solo. So let's put the three of those together to show what the swell was like in 1914. Now, in the 70s, two more stops were added to that swell. The first one added was a gedacht 8. Now, a gedacht is a flute, so we'll hear that. There was a second flute added, which is known as a raw flute. It's at 4-foot pitch, so it's an octave higher. Now, a raw flute is also known as a chimney flute, and when you get to talking about raw flutes, you start to talk about the science of acoustics. And acoustics play a very big part in the design of an organ. If you look at some of the pipes in this organ, you will, especially around the sides here, you will see a little bit of timber poking up, which is in fact a stopper with a handle on it. The way you tune those pipes is you push or pull the stopper until you get the right sound. Now, those pipes with a stopper in them are called closed pipes. These pipes up the front here, however, and you can see some stoppers around the organ, but the pipes up the front here are called open pipes. Now, there's an interesting thing about, a couple of interesting things in fact, about the difference between open pipes and closed pipes. Open pipes have to be twice as long as closed pipes to give the same pitch. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the pipes with stoppers only produce odd harmonics, where the pipes without stoppers produce both odd and even harmonics. So they sound different. Now, what they do with something like a raw flute or a chimney flute is they put a little hole in the top of the stopper with a little pipe coming out of it. And what that does is that it produces more harmonics than would be the case if you just had a stopper covering the top of the pipe. It's complicated, but it's all to do with producing a different sound with different harmonics to build up the sound. So let's hear the raw flute. The interesting thing about those three additions that we hear there is they do really seem to complement the organ very well. They've been done in a very professional way because they're the same sort of character as the rest of the organ. We should hear the pedals. Now the pedal is what they call a sub-bass. Most small organs have something called a bourdon, which is basically a soft pedal stop. A sub-bass can be the same thing as a bourdon, but it's usually the term sub-bass is used to denote a slightly louder pedal stop. That's not surprising in an organ like this because it's a loud organ. Now we have some tuning issues obviously, but what we've got here and what makes this organ I think so special is we've got this basis of sound with a whole lot of colours added to it. And although it's only a really small organ, it produces a really big sound with these very interesting colours.